since our journey to ordination begins at conception, a little bit about me and who I am, and before I put on the gray shirt. I was born in South Oklahoma City. I was born in Northeast Oklahoma City at the old Hubbard Hospital. Grew up South Side and all that implies. Spent most of my formative years in the thriving metropolitan area of Valley Brook. And for those of you that are rolling your eyes, I remember when the Valley of the Dolls was a laundromat. Okay, this is old Valley Brook. I joined the police department in 1976. I chose that career path I went to Southeast High School, and we had some pretty violent times when I was in high school. And so one day I was running across the parking lot from the police and looked over my shoulder, and I thought, well, they sick dogs on people and hit them with sticks and spray them with tear gas, and they get paid for that. I see career potential here. So I joined the police department in 1976 and retired in 2010 with 34 years on, retired at the rank of major, and it was a very, very good job for me because I didn't want to work for a living. So it was a good job for me. And yes, he's right. Nobody calls me Iron Man, but except me, because I've successfully completed an Ironman triathlon in 2010. I know I don't look like an athlete, but I did then, a senior athlete. But so my journey of faith, on Christmas Eve, 1994. And I know many of you have heard this story because I've been telling this story for 30 years, and some of the men and women here have heard this story. And so if you want to leave early and go wait in the bar at the restaurant, I won't mind. Christmas Eve, 1994, I was doing what good Protestants do on Christmas Eve. We were wrapping Christmas presents. And so I had been a good Protestant boy all my life. I was raised Assembly of God, and I was a good Assembly of God boy. I had been a faithful member of Crossroads Cathedral, which it was called then, under the preaching of Reverend Dr. Danny Schaefer, for 25 years. Very comfortable in my faith. It was a faith I knew and knew well. Christmas Eve, 1994, a voice said, "Get up and go to midnight mass." And the first thing I thought was, why would I do that? I'm not Catholic. But the feeling was so strong, and growing up in the Pentecostal church that I grew up in, we were taught from a very early age to recognize the presence of the Holy Spirit and to interact with that presence of the Holy Spirit. And so the feeling was so strong that I asked my family, I said, hey, on Christmas Eve, Catholics have a church service at midnight. They call it midnight mass, and apparently it's a really big thing to them. You hear them talking about it. They have special music and candles and bells and smells and all those other things, What say we go? And they said, well, why would we do that? We're not Catholic. And they took away my wine glass. And so I said, yeah, you're right. That's kind of a crazy thing. Well, just a little bit later, the same voice said, if you leave right now, you'll have time to make it. Okay, growing up with good Old Testament preaching, I knew what happened to people that ignored God twice. They get eaten by big fish, things like that. And so I said, I told my family, I know this is crazy, but I'm going to go. And they said, okay, we'll see you in the morning. Well, the only Catholic church that immediately came to mind was St. Andrew's in Moore. We lived Southside Oklahoma City. And so we'd been there for a baptism. Some neighbors had their children baptized and invited us to go. So I got up and I drove down there, and I sat in the parking lot for a while watching people go in. And I thought, they look normal enough. Nothing really out of kilter here. So finally, it's getting close to midnight, and I realize if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to do this now. So I get up and I go in. And you guys, probably most of you have been in St. Andrews. You know, it's kind of a in the round sort of thing, and it's low ceilings and everything. And so I go in, it's standing room only. It's midnight mass. And what I was struck by first was how quiet it was. I mean, I was Pentecostal. When we got to church before the service started, that's when everybody got caught up on the gospel. I mean, on the gossip, not the gospel, on the gossip. And so there was this constant roar. I go in there and it's absolutely silent. So I find a folding chair against the wall and I sit down and I have no idea what I'm doing there. All of a sudden a bell rings and everybody stands up, and I think I've set off the Protestant alarm or something. I'm expecting guards and dogs. But luckily it was just the procession, Father Pupius. And so you go down, the mass started. I stand up when everyone stands up and I sit down when everyone sits down. I don't understand any of it. And yet it makes perfect sense. So the next morning my wife says, well, how was it? And I said, it's going to sound crazy coming from me, but I felt like I was home. And she goes, well, yeah, that sounds crazy coming from you. I said, I would like for you to go with me next week. And she said, okay. So the next Sunday, we went to one of the masses. We're sitting there waiting, and the first thing she said was, they look pretty normal. And I said, yeah, I got that too. And she said, and the next thing she said was, there's a lot of crying babies in here. Yeah, seems to be kind of a standard thing. So after the mass, I said, what'd you think? And she said, wow. She said, it's, you know, they seem to have this order of things because everybody knows what to do and we don't, but it really felt familiar. So the next weekend, the big test was our two teenagers. We want you to go to church with us. We already go to church. Well, we want you to try this new church with us. So they went. And so after the mass, I asked my daughter, who I think was 14 at the time, I said, well, what'd you think? And she said, well, I got to admit the music's a little lame. Of course, you know, we came from Pentecostal rock and roll. And so she said, but they preach about love. She said, well, we never hear that. So we go a couple more masses, and then one day at the mass, they announced that they're going to be signing up for RE. I had no idea what that was. So I asked someone, what's RE? That's religious education. The kids go to it. Oh, great. So we go get in line, and we get up to the counter, and little Sister Paulette is taking the information. And she looks at me, and I said, I would like to sign up my kids for RE. She said, well, you don't look familiar. Are you from this parish? I said, no. She said, well, what parish are you from? And I said, she said, are you Catholic? And I said, no. And so she looks at my wife. She said, well, did you marry a Catholic? And I said, no. And I think she almost said, why are you here? But she stopped herself and said, well, you'll have to be Catholic. And I said, well, we would like to be Catholics. Well, you'll have to go through the classes. Great. Well, they start next year. Can we still go to Mass? Well, yes, you can still go to Mass. So we went through RCIA as a family and were confirmed at Easter of 1996. The only Catholics in either one of our families. And it's still that way. And so as soon as I was confirmed through the RCIA, it was in RCIA back in the good old days. Through the RCIA process, I was a sponge, as many who come into the church late in life, especially who come in from strong faith traditions. You're like a sponge. You want to know everything the Catholic Church has because you start to see why you're there. It's because all of the truths are here. You know, Father Pupius, when he was at St. Andrews, used to have ecumenical church services where he'd invite the local neighborhood churches to come in for a church service at St. Andrews. They'd bring their instruments, they would preach. We didn't do Mass, it was all about them, but they would do that in that environment. And he told me, I said, why do you do this? And he said, well, you know, the fundamentalists, especially the Pentecostals, they're a little light on the sacraments, but they do know and how to worship the Holy Spirit. And so when through all of the RCIA, I'm soaking up all of this stuff about church teachings, and I find the permanent diaconate, and I realize, oh, this is what I'm here for. This is me. And so as soon as I was confirmed in the church, I called Deacon Dennis Frazier. He and I went back in law enforcement years and years. One way to describe it in the law enforcement community is that we've pointed guns at the same people, okay? So, at the same time. And so I called Dennis, and he had not very long before that been ordained a deacon. And so I said, Dennis, that's what I want to do. I want to be a deacon. He goes, whoa, wait a minute. Let's see if it takes. But I didn't know you had to be a Catholic for 5 years before you can be a deacon. And so I was disappointed. I thought, I was so excited. I'd read all of the great history of the diaconate and how they serve that role as kind of a bridge, kind of a connection between the community and the altar. And I was disappointed. Well, through that summer, I was invited to attend a Cursillo weekend. And so I lived it, and those of you, and I know many of you are Cursillistas, you know that no one leaves a Cursillo unchanged. And for some, it's a life-altering event. And for me, it was. But when I came out of Cursillo, I had this unexplained thought that I needed to learn sign language. Okay, there were no deaf in my family. I had never seen deaf or sign language interpreters in a Catholic church. And so I'm thinking, oh, that's odd. But then it's been one of those journeys, hasn't it, God? So I call OSU OKC. I knew they had an interpreter program because I got my associates in police science there. And so I called them and I said, hi, I'd like to sign up for the program. They said, well, sorry, we're full. And I said, okay, well, when does the next one start? And they said, well, wait just a minute. And so she comes back to the phone and she says, there is one spot left. Okay. So I start the program, still having no clue as to why I'm there, but I'm doing my best to learn. Well, about 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, I tell the instructor, I said, I'm going to be late next week because I'm an RE instructor at our church, and I have a meeting to go to. And she said, RE, are you Catholic? And I said, yes. And she said, have you ever seen the Mass in sign language? And I said, no. She goes, Holy Angels, Sunday morning. Okay. So I go to the early Mass at Holy Angels on that Sunday morning. And so I sat down, and there's 2 rows of deaf in front of me, chatting with each other. And the interpreter gets up there, the Mass begins, the interpreter begins interpreting. The instructor was Joan Blake, who was an archdiocesan instructor for years, decades. The Mass starts in sign language, and it's almost like I can feel the Holy Spirit go. And I thought, okay, God, you and your sense of humor, this is what it is. And so I went through the interpreting program and became an interpreter, first at St. James and then at St. Monica's for 10 years. Kind of put the whole deacon thing on the back burner. And so about 10 years or so at St. Monica's, one day I come home and the Sooner Catholic has arrived, and so I sit down and I always read all the way through it, open it up, and the first page I open up, it says, accepting applications for the permanent diaconate. This is 2008. And I said, this is God's message right there. Okay, now you can. And so I called to find out what the process was, and they sent me an application, and you had to have a priest to sponsor you there. So I went back to my parish priest, my original parish priest, and he said, you haven't been in our parish for 10 years. You've been traveling around because the deaf tended to move sometimes to different parishes. You've been traveling around with the deaf. You're not really a member of our parish. I said, okay. And I thought, well, that's that. You know, it wasn't what I thought it was. Father Robert Wood calls me out of the blue. And he said, I understand you want to apply to the diaconate. And I said, well, what had happened was a friend of ours, my wife was complaining to them, they were Catholic, was complaining to them that I couldn't get in. And so she had called Father Wood, and Father Wood called me. And I said, well, Father, he said, and he had been the parish priest where I was interpreting. And he said, I'll back you on this. I'll get you in. I said, well, actually the applications have closed 2 weeks ago. And he said, not for me. So that was the journey to that point. The journey, as I said, the journey to formation begins at conception, I think. Because God has these plans. We don't appreciate the long range and the wide breadth of his plans. His sense of timing is unique, to say the least. I sometimes counsel people that when they get frustrated with wanting God to move faster, I said, you got to remember that God wears a watch, but it only has a minute hand. And so every time you complain and he looks at it and he goes, no, we're right on time. Because it's his time. And so I have learned that when we open ourselves to that recognition that he does move in mysterious ways, and he moves through people all around us and events and things like that, then you look back over it and it starts to really fall into place of why all of these things occurred. It was all planned from the very beginning. And so my journey from how I grew up in a biblical-based, fundamentalist faith tradition, powerfully strong, missing only the Eucharist. But when I became Catholic, I realized that what was missing. Now as a Catholic, I look back and I much more fully understand and appreciate my faith as I was growing up. And I don't think I would fully appreciate or love the faith I have now in the Catholic faith if I had not had that kind of background. Now, sometimes my Pentecostal upbringing comes through in my homilies, I've been told. But that's okay. We all need a little spice every once in a while. But it's given me the incredible opportunity to go from being taught that Catholics were all probably going to hell because they worshiped Mary and statues and Lord knows what else went on in there, to getting to stand 3 feet from where heaven touches earth on that altar. There's just no explanation for it other than this is how God works. And so one thing that I learned in Cursillo is that watching, and of course, I only worked the men's Cursillos, but watching the men come into the Cursillo and then watching them leave, and watching them come in and watching them leave, that I grew to understand that God will put together an entire weekend, pull the team together, all the logistics, all of the talks, all of the things that take place in that weekend, so that one man can hear one thing that changes their life. So when we, as supporters of those young men and women who may be discerning, may be hearing God's call, and we all know that when God talks to us, we have too great of a tendency to go, no, that can't be right. That can't be real. For one thing, it's too soft of a voice, because we forget God does not shout. He doesn't have to. And he won't try to talk over the world. So we, as those who are trying to help identify, support, and guide those young people to these vocations, we should be very comfortable with the fact that sometimes it's just something very simple that we say. It's not us. It's how the Holy Spirit is going to say something to them. But when we think, you get that for just a second, well, I should say this, and you go, oh no, I shouldn't say that because I don't know anything about this, and I'm not a good role model, and I'm not all these things. That's the Holy Spirit wanting you to do that. And when we do those things for Him, powerful things happen. So again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you. It's a story I obviously love to tell because I tell it exactly the same way for 30 years. But your support of the vocations is making a difference. Your prayers, your financial support, it is changing lives, not only for the young men and women who will join take those vocations in life, but for every one of those souls they interact with. And that's worldwide. So again, thank you. Am I supposed to answer questions?
Usually questions, your lapel mic is not going to pick the question, so would you summarize the question before you answer?
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Where are you now? What's happening?
At Saint Mark the Evangelist in Norman, you know, the rich parish in Norman.
And do you have any vocations at that parish that are coming?
Justin Link is finishing up formation as a permanent deacon. He's an acolyte. He has another year. By the grace of God, he'll be ordained. Rich. Dennis and Father Jacoby and I all sat at the same table when we lived our Cursillo at St. John the Baptist, sat at the table of Thomas Aquinas. I'm sorry, I rambled off. But yes, we have one, and we have a seminarian, John Rocker, just started seminary. And he's going to be, by the grace of God, he'll be a great priest. He's a little too serious. Luckily, the two deacons that myself and Deacon Joe Vandervoort, some of you may know him, who are assigned at St. Mark, we'll have him loosened up by the time he's.
John and my daughter run cross country together at the mountain.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and she's signed up for a sponsor, so she always pray for him. It's amazing. Yeah, we love John.
He's going to be good. Yes, he is very serious. Yes, ma'am.
Did your two children remain in the Catholic faith?
They are not as engaged as I would like, as sometimes happens. They are Gen Xers at the end of Gen X, and that's not uncommon. I know we're finding out now. But we take the grandchildren as much as we can with us. We'll impart it one way or the other. Yes, ma'am.
So as far as the training for the diaconate, there are age parameters you have to apply.
What are you saying? What are you implying? How did I get in? Okay. The question was about the deacon. Sorry, I've forgotten to ask remind people of the questions about diaconate formation. 35 to 65, I think, is the age parameters that are written down. We see for a long time young men, relatively speaking, coming into the permanent diaconate would, if they had small children at home, they would be asked to postpone that until their children were more. Most of the men, when I went through, that were coming in were in their late 50s. Most of us who were approaching retirement or were retired. That's kind of turned around, and there's Justin Link in our parish that's finishing up formation, has babes in arms in his family. Has like five kids, all shorter than that, and so bless his heart. So the formation schedule stays the same. It's a weekend a month, and 2 weeks in the summer, and for I think it's 5 years now. Be 5 years. And it's a great process. Yes, ma'am.
When you give your homilies, do you sign them, and do you still sign them in the parishes?
She asked if I sign the homilies or the in the parish. We don't have any deaf in our church, and so there's not really need for it. And after I was ordained, then I had other responsibilities, and so I wasn't available to interpret anymore. My skills are weak. I can carry on a conversation, but I've been given the opportunity once. We had the deaf community at St. James invited a deaf priest from back on the East Coast to come in and do a retreat, and he celebrated Mass. I was given the opportunity to serve as deacon, so the entire Mass was in sign language and without voice interpretation. So it was a unique environment, and it was something I really was glad to get the chance to do. I think that God used that for me to his direction to learn sign language and interact with the deaf community, because they were so supportive of me through my formation, and especially when I was first ordained. And their prayers and support helped me through a lot of it. Yes, sir.
What advice would you have for young men who have either applied or considering applying for the diaconate with young children?
The question was what advice I would give them. If God is calling you to do that, do it. God doesn't make mistakes. And if a man feels like, now, does that mean that is the path that's going to go? Because how many of us have believed we've done are doing what God has said for us to do? It was a little bit off from that, and then we find out that going through the process of the application or the discernment for it, the prayer to prepare ourselves for that, then we find out we really identify the path that God has given us. But any time that we feel that tug on our hearts, that's how the Holy Spirit works. And I would tell any young man, pray about it deeply and quietly so that you can hear what God is saying, because God does talk to us constantly. We just ignore him too much. Yes, ma'am. Well, I spent 35 years in law enforcement. It's hard to be surprised. But I think it was, I'm not sure exactly how to put this into words. When you're approaching the actual ordination Mass, you know, everything that you've learned through formation, everything, all of this is running through your head. And you think you're pretty well versed. And I was very fortunate to go through formation as a parishioner at St. James the Greater in South Oklahoma City. Was given the opportunity to, Father Bill Pruitt said when he came there, I was already in formation. When he came there, he said, you know, there's no way to learn how to physically do the stuff. There's no better way to learn it than by screwing it up. So it's time for you to be hands-on. He put me in an alb, and I assisted at the altar from the time I was in the very first part of the formation. So this gave me a great comfortableness with that top part of it. But all of the rest of it is like swirling around in your head. But at ordination, when the Archbishop puts his hands on your head, there's something that happens. I mean, it's not a big spark. You don't get dizzy, or I didn't get dizzy anyway. Some might. But what the biggest surprise was, after ordination, I seemed to know things that I did not know I knew. I think, well, we know what it is. It's a handing down of this thing that comes all the way from the apostles. And so there is power that is imparted. There is authority that is imparted. There is knowledge that is imparted in that laying on of hands. That's why it takes place. That's why it's done. And people would ask me stuff, and I would know the answer. And I thought, as I'm saying it, I'm thinking, how do I know this? That was the biggest surprise to me. And how much fun it is baptizing babies. I knew it was going to be. When you're finishing up formation, they interview you for the Sooner Catholic. They send you a list of questions, and they publish them in the Sooner Catholic. And it says, what is the one thing you're looking forward to being able to do as a deacon? And my brother deacons in my formation class had these wonderfully poetic answers about, theology and the church fathers and the opportunity to teach and preach. And I just said, baptizing babies. Because I can't see anything more powerful than getting somebody started on their way to heaven with something as simple as that. And deacons are really good at baptizing babies, because we especially after we baptize them, I always hold the child, and so they can get a picture of me, because I want a picture of me with them. And I always tell the parents, you don't have anything to worry about, because deacons are a lot better at holding babies than priests are. Okay. Most of us are fathers. Most of us are grandfathers. Some of us are great-grandfathers. We're really good at holding babies. But it's just, and growing up, and when I do the baptism seminars, I always offer the parents, we have a big holding pond behind Saint Mark. And I always offer them, because I grew up Pentecostal, I do baptisms in the pond if you wish. No one's ever taken me on it, but I said, if it was good enough for me, it should be good enough for you. But I didn't really, until I understood the churches, the capital C churches' teachings on that sacrament as the foundation of all sacraments, that what all of that meant. All of those prayers, all those blessings, the exorcism that we do. It's the only time deacons get to do an exorcism. And it's quick, and it doesn't seem that scary, but we are praying a prayer of exorcism to drive away evil spirits so we can anoint this temple, this new temple of the Holy Spirit. So that is one of the things that I just probably cherish most of all, is getting to be part of that for that child, because that's something that's going to last that child for the rest of their lives. So anyway, sorry. I'll roll on if you give me a chance. Okay, no hands up, that's it. One. Oh yes, ma'am. There were some that did, but we weren't church friends as Pentecostals, but they came from other faith traditions all about the same time. We have, I still have very spirited brotherly arguments with my Pentecostal brothers. I tell them, the Bible, whether it's literal or figurative, and I say, you guys, to you the Bible is figuratively everything, sixth chapter of John. That's figurative to us. That's real. And so we laugh about that, because that's not true. I was a good Protestant, I know that. I speak fluent Protestant. Even the Holy Roller dialects, I can.